Hello and welcome to Share International Live. We're glad you could join us today, viewers from around the world. Just to let you know, we have people joining us from 30 countries, and I'll just read out some of the names of those countries. We have folks from Albania, Belgium, New Caledonia, South Sudan, Tunisia, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, Sri Lanka, Croatia, Puerto Rico, Japan, and Turkey. So welcome those of you from those countries and the other countries that I didn't remember. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. We hope you hear some useful and inspiring information to take with you today. These webinars aim to present and explore ideas and information which you may find useful, inspiring, perhaps utopian, and maybe even you might see these ideas as the result of plain old common sense. Our topic today is Lessons from a Divided World and the Way Forward. But before we get into the meat of the program, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Joining us from Amsterdam is Felicity Eliot. Felicity is the chief editor of Share International magazine, and she began working with Benjamin Creme in 1976 in London. From Canada, we have Shereen Tayles. Shereen is a human rights specialist and has been volunteering for Share International for 12 years. From France, we have Luc Guillory. Luc has been a volunteer with Share International since 1988. And we also have with us Haley Moore, originally from New Zealand, now residing in San Francisco. Haley will be keeping an eye on your questions and putting them to the panel a little later in the program. And my name is McNair Ezzard. I'm your moderator, and I've been volunteering with Share International since 1981. We chose our topic for today, Lessons from a Divided World and the Way Forward, because many people, many of us around the world are trying to make sense of what is happening in the world. It seems that we have come to an impasse about how to address the many crises that we are facing. Why so many of our systems are breaking down or are losing their effectiveness, our political, our economic, our social, and our religious systems. So how are we going to solve these problems, and what's the way forward? Left to our own devices, many people think there wouldn't be much hope for the world. Fortunately, however, we are not alone. We do have help, and we're going to be talking about, in part, that help that is here to assist humanity. If the past few years, and especially 2020, have taught us anything, it's that all life on Earth is interconnected and related. And if we are going to have any hope of ever saving ourselves and the planet, there has to be an imperative for change. The old ways are no longer working, and many of us sense that we need a better way to live together so that all life can flourish, human and non-human alike. But before we go to our panelists, I would like to tell you a little bit about Share International. We are a worldwide group of volunteers who have been drawn together by our response to the information provided by British artist and esotericist Benjamin Creme. Mr. Creme was a student of what is known as the Ageless Wisdom Teachings, and for over 40 years he traveled the world sharing his information about the coming into the world of Maitreya the World Teacher and the Masters of Wisdom. Benjamin Creme worked in close cooperation with one of these Masters of Wisdom who provided him with the extraordinary information that we continue to make available to the public. So we aren't asking you to believe everything that we say here today. We only ask that at least for the next hour or so, that to whatever degree is possible, you try to keep an open mind and make room in your mind for some of these ideas. We don't present this information as dogma. It's not about religion. Our information really is a broader understanding of what constitutes spirituality. Let me share with you just a few concepts from the Ageless Wisdom Teachings. The Ageless Wisdom Teachings are a great body of spiritual teachings which have been handed down to humanity throughout the ages. These teachings say that each person is a soul in incarnation, And each of us is on an evolutionary journey, evolving through successive lives, gradually to eventually achieve perfection. And really the major difference between us and this group of masters, the masters of wisdom, is that they have gone ahead of us on the evolutionary path and have already achieved this perfection. And they no longer have to incarnate on this planet. Fortunately for us, for humanity, however, a number of these masters do choose to stay with us and help humanity. The masters have been the inspiration behind humanity's greatest achievements through the centuries, be it in the sciences, the arts, politics, economics, social movements, and so on. And they are returning to the everyday world now because they want to help us avert catastrophe. At the head of this group of masters of wisdom is Maitreya the World Teacher, and although he is known by various names around the world, he is not here as a religious leader. He is not here to start a new religion. He's a modern man concerned with modern problems. He and his group, the Masters of Wisdom, are here to guide us in making the needed changes in the world and to inspire us to discover and to make manifest our innate divinity. They will help, not by infringing our free will, but by offering their insight and their wisdom. And if we choose their help, they've assured us that we can change the world. To bring about these changes, Maitreya has certain priorities for humanity, not the least of which is the provision of food for all people everywhere, adequate shelter, healthcare, and education for all, as well as inspiring us to restore the planet to health. These concerns and the basic ideas of the Ageless Wisdom form the background from which we speak today, but our focus today is on the practical problems and their practical solutions. I'd like to get the ball rolling by turning to our panelists now, but before I do that, we'll say goodbye to Haley for the time being. She'll be ready to receive any questions that our viewers would like to present, and then she'll be bringing those back to us a little later in the program. So thank you, Haley. Felicity, I'd like to turn to you first and say that the pandemic over the last year has shown us, as I said in the introduction, that all life on Earth is interdependent. It's also shown us, as we've tried to fight the pandemic, that the countries of the world continue to operate in the same old ways of non-cooperation and competition. And I'm just wondering, could you speak to how did we get to this point? I guess, first of all, even having such a thing as a pandemic happen, and how did we get to this divided approach to how we are working on the pandemic?
Yes, I think that's a question that many of us are asking ourselves around the world at the moment. And it's extraordinary that, for example, it was 2 days ago that Médecins Sans Frontières and also a wonderful organization started by the French doctors and French journalists, and also Oxfam together with them, put out a statement to show how divided we are still at the moment. We have had a year, and now we have just marked the time of 1 whole year since we really knew that we were in for a long haul. And now a press release has been put out to say that people in Africa, for example, are not being vaccinated. South Africa has to pay at the moment 2.5%. It pays 2.5%, double what other countries pay for the vaccine. So we're extraordinarily divided. Now, I know that many people are not necessarily in favor of having the vaccine themselves, but the whole world should have, just as you've just mentioned, we all need access to food, water, healthcare, shelter, etc. Just as that applies as a basic human right, so should access to vaccines and to medicine apply to everyone throughout the world, irrespective of which country it is. If there's one thing that the pandemic teaches us, it is that, as you have said, we are interdependent. And not only are we as humanity interdependent, but we are interdependent and interconnected with every single other life form on this planet. And we're beginning to realize this to our cost. We see that we're losing biodiversity, and this is affecting our agriculture and so on and so on. We see that everything is connected and there is a chain of life, and we need every single part of it. How have we got to this situation? I'd like to go back to our overall overarching title for this series of webinars, which is the imperative of change in order to create a sane and just world. Well, that title says it, because if there was ever a time when we need to change, it is now. And we have to find out, obviously, the hard way, I'm afraid. And we have to discover for ourselves this interconnectedness. Now, how do we get there? You have explained in your introduction that we are all souls in incarnation. Now, I wonder if people actually start to take that on board, that we are quite different to the separate people that we see going about our business every day. If we begin to take that as a basis, surely we must begin to change. And yet still we are plagued by this sense of separateness. I was asked recently, what do you think the reasons are for COVID, or what do you think the causes are? Now, I might make a slight difference between the reasons and the causes. The causes all of us know. For example, it is to do with how we deal with the natural resources, how we deal with other kingdoms in nature. But it is also to do, and I think at basis, we still do not know who we are, what we are. We have not explored our full nature. We see ourselves as people with minds and brains and so on. And you know that medical science and many other scientists at the moment equate mind and brain. Yet for someone coming at it as we do from a different point of view, we see the mind as that which uses the brain. And what uses the mind and the brain is something higher still, and that is this divine being, this divine aspect of ourselves, which is simply a higher aspect of who we are and what we are. And that is the highest and best in us. What we see in everyday life is the other aspect of us, which is the everyday self. And so we're not being ourselves at our best. And we're not living according to our aspiration and everything that should come from knowing that you are a soul in incarnation.
How do we get to this united approach? I mean, the different countries of the world, you touched on it, what you've already said. I mean, we hear a lot from the WTO and the WHO about vaccine nationalism, which is a reflection of this separation that we have. But how do we get to this unified approach to address these issues, not just the pandemic, but other issues that divide us?
Just building on Felicity's statement and on your question, McNair, on what's caused some of these problems is, I think certainly we just have to look at the systems that we have in place and the capitalist system and the basics of that. And it's really done us a lot of harm. So, you know, capitalism has encouraged mass consumption, competition, greed. You know, it provides an incentive for business owners to harm the environment and people for monetary gain. And we've just let this go on and on and on. It's an effective and unstable system. You know, a lot of nations engage in free trade, including the European Union and NAFTA, but these are still designed just to benefit the few and ignores people's needs. And it, of course, results in wealth inequality, and it does not promote equal opportunity. So when we look at how have we gotten this far, it's because we've basically just done whatever we wanted, and we haven't been unified. We've not been able to, at any point in history, come together and work together. I mean, finding a vaccination for COVID-19 would have been the perfect opportunity for countries to come together and to work together, and we still haven't managed to do that. You know, I mean, I could go on about the effects of a capitalist system, but I mean, it's just that we need to change that. There's something fundamentally wrong. We've come up with all different sorts of things that we want to try. We have tried, they're not working. And there's a lot of things we haven't tried yet. We haven't tried sharing. We've not tried a universal basic income. We've not tried so many things that could help us and actually help us move forward and protect all of humanity.
That's right. I think we're sort of caught, as you say, in our systems. And I think many people would like to make a difference, would like to change, but we don't see how, because we still feel as if we're caught within these systems. And if, again, we look at issues such as corruption around the world, where in certain countries, for example, the judiciary and the police force have been bribed and are in league with let's say, totalitarian or dictatorial or certainly repressive regimes. And this we see happening around the world. And again, there are so many issues which we allow, as you have said, Shereen, to continue. And we've seen this for centuries. And humanity has been asked to respond to so many crises over the years, and we could have made the changes then.
We're saying the masters and Maitreya are in the world teacher. Have they given out any teachings about how we can work together better, or how we can minimize some of these crises that we face?
Well, yes, they did. Of course, they have done that repeatedly. And to summarize that in my own words, I would say that they have taught us that humanity is one and has to see itself as one. And once we become aware of that, really, not theoretically, then it will be natural to share the resources of the world. And it's true that, as my colleagues have said, that we are on the opposite side at the moment. And one big problem is that the neoliberal economy is not interested, neoliberal capitalism is not interested in common good. And so we have to stimulate the will to good among the people and groups and nations so that we will cooperate in a better way than what we achieve today. And so the masters probably are awaiting a reaction from humanity at the moment because of this crisis.
Absolutely.
We already had an opportunity in 2008 when we had a financial crash to change the rules, to cooperate, but we did not, because we still have the market forces acting through the financial markets of the world, keeping their grip on the economy, on the financial system, on the monetary system, on the resources of the world, on the wealth, on the riches, on everything they can grasp, take, and privatize in order to make profits out of it. And so they are still so strong that we could not do anything differently.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not so pessimistic at the moment, despite what Shereen and Felicity have said, because there's a tiny hope at the moment. We can see there is a little shift going on. We were talking about vaccines in Africa. Well, there is an initiative set up by the World Health Organization, which has been criticized quite a lot by people, by nations, by states, by every kind of groups of civil society. But they have set up a facility called COVAX, and COVAX is an initiative through which they intend to fund the purchase of vaccines. Either you are for or against, another story, for poor nations, for low-income nations, and for emerging nations. And I just read in the newspaper a couple of days ago that Ethiopia has received 2.2 million doses of vaccine thanks to this mechanism.
Mm.
So we can see that there is a little hope of something to be changed in the near future.
Yeah, I must make it clear, I'm not at all negative or feeling depressed or have lost hope. I don't despair. In fact, I think this is one of the most positive, yes, actually a tragedy, but which we can turn to our advantage and turn and make it the turning point for the world. If we can't change now, but I think we will change now, and I see there's all signs of it. If I may, I have a short video clip showing Benjamin Creme talking about one of the problems which we succumb to, and it is to do with our tendency in a certain direction. I would like to show that now, if I may. It just puts a certain light on the issue.
We in the developed world think only of ourselves. Complacency is the crudest and worst aspect of human life. It's belief in separation. Complacency is the result of feeling separate. They don't care. We're complacent. We don't care. We are all right, check. We have an income. I know there are some people who don't have an income anymore. Too bad. It's too bad. It's sad. It's just too bad. That's not an attitude. That's complacency. Instead of saving the banks, the government should be saving people's jobs. Instead of even doing that, they should be putting food into people's mouths. The people are dying throughout the world because of the complacency of the rest of us. Not from lack of food being there, the food is there, but from our lack of humanity. Our sense that the dollar, the pound, the yen, the euro is more important than anything else. So we do nothing, and humanity slips bit by bit, by doing nothing, into the structuring of its life round money. Money is the great king, the great God that must be fed.
So which countries, I mean, it may be self-evident, but which countries suffer most from this complacency?
That's an interesting question. I suppose we all do. To be fair, and I think that we all do, and I think we all do personally, individually, as well as countries. Of course, there are countries which are more attuned to the needs of others through their social systems and their political systems, economic systems. And for example, we can think of the Scandinavian countries, broadly speaking, who have a better balance between the socialist aspect of their lives and the some form of capitalism. And it works to create a better, more balanced society. And indicators, polls taken, always show that there is, or has been up to now anyway, less crime, more what could be measured as in Bhutan. I don't know if, I'm sure many listeners and viewers know about Bhutan, which it has not gross national product, not GDP, but it talks about gross national happiness quotient. And so they have as their standard of measuring a happy or rather a successful society is to say, well, what's the happiness quotient? And we know that many of the Scandinavian countries tend in this direction, to be more equal, more just in the way all sorts of access is given to the entire population so that they have the wherewithal. And you also have countries like Finland that has experimented recently with the universal basic income. A limited experiment, but nevertheless a successful and interesting one. And I believe this idea is taking hold throughout the world.
Well, since you brought that up about the universal basic income, let me ask Shereen, what kind of effect would such a program have on the different economies of the world, say on capitalism, capitalistic countries or communist countries? I mean, is there any, and also is there any realistic hope that something like that can be implemented anytime soon?
Yeah, certainly I do. I think for some countries, it's definitely realistic. The concept, I mean, at least here in Canada, is slowly becoming very difficult for people to ignore. And interest in a UBI has been intensified because of COVID-19. But even before the pandemic, I mean, the interest was there, and that's just a consequence of a larger societal discomfort. So there was always a need somehow for it. I was reading a report on a website called worldpopulationreview.com, and as of 2021, there were 13 countries that have tried to implement a UBI. They've all done so in sort of short-term experiments, and no country has passed a law to make it legally binding yet, but it does show that there are very active groups lobbying for a UBI, including here in Canada, where in fact just a couple of weeks ago, a member of Parliament, Judy Zurowitz, introduced a bill which is Canada's first ever bill towards a national guaranteed basic income. So if that passes, it would definitely make it a reality here in Canada. And what really strengthened that idea was that during the pandemic, Canada created a benefit for those people who are unable to work because of COVID-19, called the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, and it guaranteed $2,000 per month for anybody who couldn't work. And that meant because they were sick or they were, you know, their child's school was closed and they had to take care of, I mean, it was pretty big in the sense that there wasn't a lot of criteria. A lot of people would qualify for that benefit. So it really made people realize that we can afford that kind of a benefit and it wouldn't have a negative impact on our economy. And quite the contrary, the housing market, which is a sign of an economy's health, has been booming in places like Vancouver, which is, of course, one of the most expensive cities in the world. Yeah.
Is there any correlation between a country that lives either under capitalism or socialism or a combination of that or communism? Is there any correlation between how open they might be to a universal basic income?
China, for example, is one of the countries that has tried a universal basic income. I don't know the details of the project that they've done, but they are on, you know, the list of one of the 13 countries. There's actually a whole list of very different economies that have tried it. I think we have to be really humble about what we know and what we don't know, because there hasn't been a country that has tried it long enough to know what their long-term impacts are. And I think, you know, it may be more or less feasible based on their current economic landscape. So there'd have to be a lot of conversations at local levels about how it might fit into their economy. We just don't know how it would work. But for example, as Felicity was mentioning earlier about Scandinavian countries, you take a country like Norway that has a system closest to a universal basic income because it's a welfare state. And, you know, they may not be motivated by poverty-related objectives because that may not be one of their biggest problems, but they may have some job insecurity because of automation-driven job loss. So there may be a different objective why this could benefit their society. And then on the other hand, you have a sort of typical low-income setting where a UBI could expand coverage for its people, but it may also be financially daunting, or at least in the short term. But again, we don't know in the long term, you know, what happens. I mean, if people are able to secure their basic needs like housing and food and medicine, then it may have a very positive impact on their society. So I think there may be room for any economy, but everyone's got to work this out and have local conversations about it and how it may fit.
Right.
If you think of what McNair was saying, that the masters are in the world and that there is a world teacher, someone who is here, and that we have the possibility, once we take the right steps, of benefiting from their advice and guidance, then, and if you think that, and if you know that they would never waste their time or energy, they're here because this is a time, this is our moment, it's happening on our watch. If we need to make these changes now, and we have all the wherewithal. It is a question of really putting pressure at every level on local governments, national governments, regional, etc., and starting to look very carefully at bringing more and more people into a political process so that you have more and more people being able to put their ideas into the community and then take that up, scale that up to a higher level and a broader level, so that you have people actually feeding into the think tank that we all are, to find the best ideas and let those come forward so that we can make these changes. I mean, at the moment, it is quite extraordinary. I was doing some investigation into, because I find it quite fascinating that we even have a concept of thinking about a rich country. That seems to me to be wrong straight away, the idea of a rich country. Surely it should be a country which can provide for its people. But I looked up some facts, and I believe, I'm just going to quote here, I'll have to read it. 157 of the top 200 economic entities by revenue are corporations, are businesses, not countries. Now that's extraordinary. 10 of the greatest corporate entities have revenues which exceed 3 trillion or more each. So that is extraordinary. There are corporations which are more powerful than countries, and some countries would easily be brought down by corporations like that. If they so wished. And the problem is that they continue to make money. Isn't it an extraordinary idea that in 2020, billionaires became even richer and benefited off the tragedy of COVID and all that it has meant to society so far?
Yeah. I noted a few figures given by the famous NGO Oxfam about what you said, Felicity, because they made a survey, and I do like figures because figures are figures and they can support a theory very practically. So what Oxfam report says is that it took only 9 months in 2020 for the 1,000 richest people to recover the wealth they had before the crisis, only 9 months, whereas it took them 5 years after the crash in 2008. And their richness, their wealth has increased by 3,900 billion US dollars, almost 4,000 billion US dollars. That is twice the French gross domestic product, so it's amazing. The problem is that, on the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, the estimation is that between 200 and 500 million people have fallen under the poverty threshold. And so that's terrible. And what also Oxfam highlights is that there are some 700 million women who are working in the informal economy and who have seen a drop in their income by 60%. And so what we see is that the COVID crisis has increased the inequalities, or it has at least highlighted the inequalities that were existing before. And the situation now is even worse to some extent. And so for there are rich countries, there are poor countries, there are middle-income countries. But for those who are not rich and who are not able to set up rescue packages, as we could see in Europe or in the USA, which is a kind of national Marshall Plan, right? In fact,
Yes.
there's a huge challenge for the international community to help them. Otherwise, it might be terrible for the coming years because, for example, the UN organization called UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, has noted a drop in the foreign direct investment in 2020 by 42%. It means that we are hampering the future possibilities for progress and development in those countries. So this is really a huge challenge at the moment.
So Luke, has anything that the World Teacher and the Masters have said, has anything they've said going to help us to get from where we are now to the implementation of his priorities, of the World Teacher's priorities, food, shelter, education?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Maitreya in particular made it clear that we need to, the very, very first priority, to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. And recently, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, said that there are about 30 million people now in the world who are at risk of severe hunger or starvation and death. And we know that every day many people are dying of hunger. So the first priority is to eradicate poverty and to eradicate hunger. And they have recommended to set up what I mentioned, a global Marshall Plan, kind of a global program of cooperation, so that we will bring the funding, the means, and the logistic means, and many other ways to those in need. We all know that, and Benjamin Creme used to emphasize that there is no lack of food. He said that in the video we just saw. There is no lack of food in the world. There is even an excess, about 12% per capita. The problem is that the food is being rotten in big warehouses because it helps maintain the prices at the stock exchange. So we must act differently, have the nations organize themselves to bring the food to the people, to feed them, to build up inventories of security inventories of food and so on. So this is part of what they call a global Marshall Plan, to set up that, put the means in common, put the funds in common, and do the job, do the work. That's what we need.
I just want to take a second before we continue to remind folks, our viewers, if you have questions, to please submit those so that Haley can be sorting those for our panelists. Thank you. Okay, Shereen, did you have a comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with everything Luke said. I mean, I think there's things that we haven't tried that would really be helpful. I think we, like sharing the world's resources and knowledge and technology, and of course that'll make a positive impact on society. And it's just ludicrous that we live in a world where 4-year-old children have to go and work and support their families, and they can't go to school, and it's not something that just happens every now and again. It's very, very common. And to think that we just, like Luke says, there's so much food just rotting, and there's so many people that are hungry. I mean, I saw an article on BBC News about this conflict that started in Mozambique, and in a year 500,000 people have had to leave their village, and there was a man talking on there who said, I haven't eaten in 3 days, and they're waiting for this food to be delivered, and there's too many people there, so even if it does come, he may not get food. And it's just shocking to see that. And of course, we can't just see that as their problem. It's our problem, and we have to be, all countries have to be part of that solution, and how we can share these resources. And that's probably one good thing that's come from the pandemic as well. There are a lot of new initiatives that have started up, and that will share food, that will find ways to get access food and bring them to people, or medication or that kind of thing. So I mean, a lot of good has come out of it too.
One of the things we don't hear very much about in this country on the news is the effects of the pandemic. It's not only been the inability of poorer countries to get the vaccine, but all throughout this pandemic, there's been problems with transport of farm products, getting in and out of countries because of the lockdowns and stuff. So people are suffering a lot more, not just from the illness, but economically as well in the poorer countries from this. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. And I was also listening to, and I'd just like to add to it, just going back to some of the root causes, and then also the sense that we're still stuck. So what Shereen's just been saying, people on a local level have been working, and there are all sorts of initiatives and projects to help each other and so on, and neighborhood schemes, and even at a slightly higher level. But at the same time, we need, as Luke was saying, systemic change. The systems have to change so that we're not all just caught in this net of how things are. We have to put aside this apathy and the sense of, oh, well, it's always like that, and anything else is utopian. If there was one thing I think we need to learn from the pandemic, is that we have to put aside our skepticism, our apathy, our cynicism, and really tackle these issues head on and work together with other people. I was listening to Inge Andersen, who is the United Nations Environment Program Director, and she said, nature is sending us a message, and we have to begin to listen. We are approaching agriculture in the wrong way. We're approaching nature and the natural world in the wrong way. And we are encroaching so badly on natural habitat, ancient habitat of so many animal species, that we are, in fact, beginning to, and this is what we have done, we have created zoonotic diseases. I'd just like to talk about this for a minute. According to Inge Andersen from the UN Environment Programme, 75% of all emerging infectious diseases come from wildlife. Now, we know that this is the case. We have had these instances of pandemics before, or at least endemic situations before. And we've had SARS and MERS and Nipah and so on and so on, all to do with, for example, AIDS. HIV/AIDS was caused by the problem of people being in too close proximity with apes, chimpanzees, etc. And poverty plays a role here. Poverty and encroachment on natural environment, and poverty because people eat bushmeat. They no longer have enough money to have their own herds. They eat bushmeat. Bushmeat contains particular viruses, and there is a crossover from perhaps bats, etc., and people get them. Same has happened in Wuhan and so on. And we know this to be the case. And we also know from an esoteric point of view, from Benjamin Creme and his master, that pandemics, for example, in 1918, just a little over 100 years ago, just after the 1918, the First World War, the people were suffering conflict after the conflict of terrible tension, stress-related problems, hunger, desperate situation, and the psychological shock of the First World War. And then you had that huge outbreak of what we call the Spanish flu. It took 50 million lives, and some 500 million people were infected at the time. This is not our first epidemic or pandemic. We've had them before, and we should know. And virologists have been warning us for years now. In 2015, there was a study commissioned, I think, by the British government, and they found that many countries were not prepared, not sufficiently prepared. And yet countries in Asia, which had to deal with SARS, the outbreak of the SARS virus, they were prepared, and this is why they have dealt with it more efficiently, and why they have fewer numbers of fatalities.
Well, it seems like in many parts of the world, people are starting to wake up. I mean, we have examples of it in the Arab Spring, the anti-racism protests here in America and around the world, what's going on in Myanmar right now. But it doesn't, at least to my mind, it doesn't seem like enough people are awake and ready for this change. What do you panelists think it's going to take for enough of humanity to wake up to kind of help us change direction once and for all?
I do not agree fully with your statement because I do believe we don't see everything, but I believe that the pandemic has changed many people and maybe many more than we might think. People have been forced, especially because of the lockdown, they have been forced into introspection. They have pondered about life, about the real values of life, the real values of their own individual existence in particular, but the global existence, also the life of the planet, of the countries, the relations between countries, relations to nature in particular. And I just came across a survey in France because next year we have a presidential election. And that survey has shown that now about 3/4 of the French people consider that they will vote for someone who has a strong program to fight against climate change. And that is very new. 5 years ago, it was not the case. So if someone comes and doesn't speak about that, he's out or she's out. This is very new. And I think this is very hopeful because we were talking about hunger and starvation and people starving to death. Until now, it has not moved people. But it seems that if we, through the medium of climate change and the dangers and what we have just experienced with the COVID crisis, have a more global view about all these subjects, including social justice, social or economic justice, and the fight against hunger. And I think there's a kind of melting pot which is being created in that way. We have quite a chance that enough people will be changed by what has happened. Everybody has experienced it.
I'm going to hold on to your optimism because mostly what we hear in America is getting back to normal.
Oh, if there's one thing that we should not do is get back to normal. I'd like to say something about this. One of the masters of wisdom, who will in time be known to the world, was writing about and warning people about the dangers following the Second World War, the First World War and Second World War. And one of the main points that he made, I found quite interesting, particularly to do with our times, and I find it absolutely relevant. What he said was, and he actually implored, do not go back to normal. Whatever you do, do not go back to normal. And that is the main, I believe, one of the main lessons to be learned from 2020 and 2021. We have to look forward and we have to begin to imagine the kind of world we want, which we've all more or less described. But that was the advice. Do not go back to normal. Be aware of the fact that you will so easily slip back into it. And that is precisely what happened after the Second World War. In the 50s and 60s, we started being, understandably, people wanted to recover and have a better standard of living after the privations of the war and so on. But what happened was we got further and further into a kind of materiality, which has sucked us into everything that we see going wrong now and has been going wrong. We were told in the 70s by Margaret Thatcher that there was no such thing as society. And what did that do? Forced us, well, no, it helped us actually to focus on ourselves and to be selfish and separative. And where you see that separativism, that divisiveness, there you know that the materiality has got a hold and commercialization has got such a hold on us now. And this is something we have to be very much aware of. And that is why I am positive and actually optimistic about the effects of the crisis that we're in now. And I think it will, as it were, shoot us forward into a completely new way of living, a new way of life, because we've had, as Luke said, this time to ponder and think about, what's my life really about? And what am I here for? And when you begin to have what we see that we might have, and we can open ourselves up to the possibility of learning from the masters, of receiving their advice and help, when we see that it is actually, we have that input of something which, and one of you talked about spirituality and a broader sense of spirituality, when that begins to be a dominant note in our personal lives and in society, I think that we can move to a completely different type of society with social justice at its heart within a very few years.
I'm seeing that the number of questions is building, so I'd like to tend to a few of the viewers' questions. Haley?
May I, before she does, she's there already, but I was going to ask if we could play a small clip of a young doctor in London who makes an appeal to us to do what we've just been talking about. I wonder if Haley can wait.
By all means.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think, I guess I'm now speaking directly to people watching in the UK and the US and in Europe. Our silence here is complicity, because we have a voice and we have the power to put pressure on our governments to support the People's Vaccine Initiative, to waive the intellectual property rights, which will allow this knowledge and the technology of how to make these vaccines to be shared openly. And that could allow the massive upscaling of production of vaccines across the world and save millions and billions of lives. And we also need to, quite loudly remind our governments, particularly those of us in the West, that vaccine nationalism and this, economic nationalism, as some may call it, is not only a moral failure, but it is stupidly short-sighted. Because as we know, if you allow the virus to let rip, to let spread in certain countries, then that increases the risk of mutations and that increases the risk of our vaccine then becoming ineffective. So I think, to finish, I feel, sometimes it can feel maybe that we've got a bit of an impossible task. We are going against a system which has, massive vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But we also need to remember our very recent history, where HIV activists fought against Big Pharma and they won. So we need to not underestimate the power of people organizing. That's our power. And then we have to remind ourselves that we will face future pandemics and the multiple crises that we now face in the world of climate breakdown, of rising inequality. All of these, the solutions to this is global solidarity and collaboration. We need our governments to have the strength and the integrity to take on these big corporations. And we need to end this rigged system that puts profit before people's lives. And we need to demand a system that's based on fairness and transparency and democratic global governments that prioritizes our health and puts people's lives before profit. So let's demand a people's vaccine, because no one's life is disposable.
Thank you, Felicity, for sharing that. It was very powerful.
If I can just make a comment quickly before we go to the comments from that video is, what she said is so true, that we're going to face future pandemics or epidemics and future crises that will affect all of humanity. And if we can, there's still, an opportunity for everybody to work together on this pandemic that we're in. We're not out of it. We still have to distribute vaccines. There's a whole global recovery still. We could still do it all together. And I think if we can, then we're not so fearful of the future and of future pandemics, because we know that we're going to be able to work together to get through them. I mean, it's much less scary facing it all together.
Along that lines, one of the basic presentation teachings, if you will, of the World Teacher is sharing the world's resources among all the countries. And I would think that applies just as equally to the idea of the vaccine.
Yes, and we should make clear that that's not just simply sharing our implements, our tools, our cars, whatever, but it is a systemic change. We'll change a system, as Luke pointed out, so that it will become a structure which makes it possible for the just and equitable redistribution of the world's resources.
I think the theme of fear is very important. Ben said in his video, the root cause is complacency. And complacency is, I think, is very linked to fear. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a huge fear on the people, put on the people by the media. People have been frightened by the media, terribly frightened. And strangely, what we can see now is that people tend not to be afraid anymore. And this is translated in what we have seen in different countries like Myanmar after the military coup, or in Russia when the people went out to the streets to protest against the imprisonment of Mr. Navalny. And people were not afraid. You could see the pictures, you could see the videos on TV. People were not afraid. They knew what could happen. And in Myanmar, if you are arrested by the military, it means you're going to be tortured. Let's be clear about that. And in Russia, it might not be so funny each time as well. But people were fearless. And maybe there's that kind of feeling of people's. They have been so frightened by this and intently by the media that they have a reaction now where it seems that they can move forward without any fear.
Yeah. I would like to thank you, Luke, for that. I would like to move to the questions. We're coming up on the hour, just so that we get some of the questions in before we end for the day. Thank you, Haley.
All right, thank you to everybody that's asked questions. We're going to try and get to as many as we can. First one that I'd like to address is, based on some of the esoteric teachings, there are cosmic forces at play causing division. For example, the sort of cleavage, pitting brother against brother, so we can more clearly choose the right path and resolve differences. Any comments?
Felicity, would you like
Yes,
to?
I would think our times are precisely, I agree with the questioner. It is our time, precisely this time, that shows, and the pandemic is doing a brilliant job of making people choose. We're being presented with a choice. Do you work together and do you save the whole planet? Because we know that if one person is ill, many people can be ill. And so we have to move towards a justice which includes every single one of us. And we're being faced with this choice, and it faces us with choices daily. It has shown, COVID has been like a giant magnifying glass, and it has shown up every single crack in our systems. And it has shown up, for example, in our wrong relationships with other male-female relationships, so gender problems and problems of domestic violence. It's shown up our wrong relationship with nature, and so on and so on. And we are being forced to make a choice. And I totally agree. And this is an energy, it is an energy deliberately allowed to have its effect in the world at the moment, to make it clear to us, because it seems that all of these years, all of these centuries, we haven't learnt enough. Now is the time to make that choice. And I believe enough people will make that choice. And I think that's why the masters are here and why Maitreya is here, because it is possible for us to make the right choice.
Years ago, when Benjamin Creme first talked about the sort of cleavage and the opposites, one side or the other, I had no idea that it would be as sharp as it is in today's world, especially in America. You know, between the left and the right, it's really accentuated now.
We are living in a polarized world, aren't we? And I think that polarization makes the choices all the more clear.
Haley?
People have to take their stand, and they have to take their stand for justice. And I think they are now aware of many things. You see, recently there was an article in the media, in the press, saying that to talk about the financial markets and how they behave, because they will not renounce. They want to get the biggest share of the cake. And one CEO, chief executive officer of a big investment fund, allowed himself to get $500 million US dividends in 2020. So you see, this is horrible, but some people are still doing like that. But I think the majority of people become aware that this cannot go on. And this is the sort of cleavage that it's an example where you take your stand as a conservative, or if you take your stand for justice, which means you have to eradicate also that situation of financial markets ruling everything.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Luke. Haley, next question.
Yeah, this question was about UBI again, but it's talking more generally about what difference would it make if the UBI was fully adopted, permanently adopted globally, and how would that also affect the ecology of the planet?
I mean, I think it's something we have to try. I mean, I don't think we don't know what the long-term effects of a UBI would be because nobody has ever done it. I think certainly would have a positive impact on all of Maitreya's priorities. It supports self-determination in a way, you know, because it means that people have the ability to make choices and manage their own lives, which provides people with a life of dignity. And the present day economic structure just doesn't support human beings and their rights. But Maitreya's priorities as a whole, you know, has a positive impact, not just on the individual, but on everybody. So we have to see something like a UBI as an investment in humanity and not as a charity initiative or free money that will reduce the incentive to work. And that's basically the biggest criticism of the UBI. You know, but so let's say some people decide they're comfortable with the UBI and they don't want to work. I mean, so what? So we have to assume that that might happen, but the benefits to the whole of the community far outweigh the impact of what the minority might, and I say might because we don't know, do. So we just accept that might happen. But in general, you know, those short-term studies have shown that the majority of people will not do that. And we have to just start looking after each other. And something like a UBI would help to decentralize the wealth, build or sustain a middle class, provide gender equality pay, which doesn't exist in many countries. So, I mean, it's certainly worth trying. Why wouldn't we try it? I mean, we try so many things that are harmful to us and we just even keep going with it. So there's no reason, I think, not to try it. And I think we just have to, at least if one country does it, we wait and see what are the long-term impacts, and then we'll get a better idea.
Haley, what was the second half of that question? Its effect on the
ecology of the planet.
Well, I think it's important to remember that oftentimes the folks that are out getting the wildlife illegally, destroying the forest, these sorts of things in the natural environment, many of them do this because they have no other means to feed themselves, to get money, to buy the food that they need, and to get the goods that they need to take care of their families. So if this UVI was implemented, maybe that might have an effect on this tendency that, you know, people in the developing world have to want to provide for themselves.
Yeah, and also I would just add that, you know, it does, because it puts into question the basics of capitalism, where we do put money ahead of the environment. I mean, it could be that something like a UBI would support much more the environment than let's just destroy the environment for the benefit of the few.
And I think it will first and foremost relieve millions of people of the burden they have over their shoulders, the burden that they don't know what tomorrow will be. What if tomorrow they will have the ability to feed their children, if they will find the food for 1, 2 or 3 meals in a day, because millions of people, if you go out to India and you see how people live in the streets or in the landscape, many people do not know if tomorrow they can give food to the children. So it will relieve the people of that terrible burden over their shoulders. And so they will be able to do something else of their own lives. Benjamin Creme said once that we are being deprived of the creativity of maybe 2/3 of humanity, because people are only busy to try to not make ends meet, not from paycheck to paycheck, as Bernie Sanders said recently, but just to survive on a daily basis. And so it will be a great relief for those people. And I think it will be the first virtue of that system.
Okay, Haley, next question.
This question is, how are Maitreya and the Masters now in the world helping us to change, to uplift our consciousness so we can work together and to solve our problems now?
Felicity?
Well, first of all, I think the fact of knowing that there is such a thing as a brotherhood of evolved, highly evolved people, and that we are on our way to that stage as well, that incarnation and reincarnation is part of life. I think the knowledge of the Ageless Wisdom Teachings is an enormous help to people, to help people make sense of life. I think many people don't know the sense of life, or don't have a meaning, or have to look for some way to give life a meaning. So simply knowing about their existence, or at least taking it as a hypothesis and considering that it may be true, gives a certain meaning and sense to life, and a goal that perhaps is otherwise missing. But what are the Masters and Maitreya themselves doing? Well, they always have worked, and humanity has never been alone. I know that it feels very often as if we are on our own, but humanity has never been abandoned by the Masters or by Maitreya. And they have worked in the first instance and throughout the ages through people in the world, men and women who are more advanced perhaps than others, and intuitive and sensitive to the incoming ideas, which the Masters encourage. The Masters put the ideas into the mind belt, as we call it. The Masters inspire and help. And so in each aspect of life, in every sector of our society, people are being stimulated, encouraged, inspired, given ideas which bring us forward, which takes evolution forward. So it might be to do with some kind of engineering breakthrough that we need to know, or some scientific or medical breakthrough that we need. These ideas are put there, and the intuitive people of the world pick these up. So in that way, they're helping our evolution. The other way, of course, is by their constantly sending energies into the world and directing and helping where there are crises that need perhaps diffusing in some way, or perhaps there is somewhere that something needs to be encouraged and stimulated. They send their energies into the world all the time. And one of the major energies that people must sense, I think, from time to time when you partake in some extraordinary, perhaps a large collective process, is the energy of Maitreya himself. It is an energy of love which stimulates, which feeds the heart, which touches the heart of all of us who are anyone who is sensitive to it, anyone who is full of goodwill, who is altruistic, who wants the best for humanity, will be open to that energy. And that energy is often felt throughout the world at particular times. One of the particular time that I can think of is at the funeral of Lady Diana in Britain. And that energy was felt around the world by people of goodwill who perhaps knew nothing about the story and yet tuned in and sensed something unusual happening. And apparently there are more events like that that have happened in the past and will happen again, with Maitreya making himself known to the world. So these are ways in which they work, some of the ways in which they work.
And then on top of that, I mean, the ideas in people's minds and his energy, again, just to reiterate, is their physical presence in the world with us now as well. It's been ages since that's happened.
Absolutely, yeah.
I just want to make a note here that was really important that Felicity mentioned, that they do work, the Masters work through all sectors, and whether people are aware of it or not, their energy is still there. You know, whatever group is working for or towards Maitreya's priorities would certainly have hierarchy's energy behind it. And so it's not just you have to be aware of them and know their priorities and work towards it, but their energies will be behind any impact, positive impact on humanity, you know. And again, like, you know, there's the large organizations, but even the smaller groups, if they see that there's a seed there to be sown, they will put their energy behind it. So I think it's important for people to know that whether, you know, we're aware of it or not, the energies are always there.
I think what we're looking at is really a new idea of what constitutes spirituality, as I said in the intro. I mean, anything that moves humanity forward to a higher state, whether it's in economics or society in general or culturally, can be seen in this new time as a spiritual activity. The churches and the religions of the world really don't have the corner on what constitutes spiritual activity any longer, which they have had for centuries. So, Haley?
There's a few questions here asking what anyone can do in their everyday life to contribute to change for the benefit of all. How can ordinary people make a difference today?
Luke, would you like to take that on first?
Yeah, well, if we could say many things, but I think the most important thing is try to find other people who are like you, and you will find them inevitably. You will meet them, you will find them. Whatever your way in life, whatever your preferred activity, your preferred philosophy, your preferred way of action, you will find out the same people, and you can unite with them and work together. And in your own field of activity, you can find the people and work together to improve. There are so many things to improve. It's not difficult to search for one or to look for one. There is another thing which we can recommend to everybody. It's to practice some kind of meditation. And there is one particular meditation, which is called transmission meditation, which is a way of cooperating with the masters. We know from science that the world and that the universe is a universe of energy. And so on this planet, we receive energies from other sources, spiritual energies, and the masters are the custodian of those energies, and they want to distribute those energies in the best possible way to stimulate our spiritual growth, the growth of our consciousness, our awareness. And so there is a way to do it consciously and cooperatively with the masters is to practice that group meditation, which is called transmission meditation. And if you look at the Share International website, you will find information about that. Benjamin Creme wrote a book, and we spent many, many decades in informing and practicing with groups around the world that meditation. And that meditation is a way to increase, to speed up the evolution of humanity in particular, but let's stick to humanity. And so everyone can practice that. Everyone can do that. It does not require any particular skills. So whoever you are above a certain age, you can practice that. So I would recommend whatever else you would be doing as a service to humanity, at least that service you can add to your list because it's easy and everybody can do it.
And I think I don't think I'm incorrect on this. I believe the transmission meditation book is available, at least in the United States, as a free download on the
Correct, yes.
USA website.
Yes,
Together with a few of other Benjamin Creme's books.
that's right.
Haley?
Well, actually, that was one of the questions that I was asking about where people can find more perspective on the masters and their teachings.
As McNair mentioned, of course, the books of Benjamin Creme, by Benjamin Creme, and also by other disciples, people like Alice Bailey, who worked with one of the masters, There are many books, and if people search for them, they'll find them. But I recommend, of course, as I would, the books by Benjamin Creme. And as McNair said, there are some free downloadable books. And perhaps this is the moment for me just to say something about Share International. And then perhaps there are a couple more questions to finish off with, I don't know. But Share International is now in its 40th year, and it's was started by Benjamin Creme and a journalist, and they worked together on it. The extraordinary thing about Share International magazine is that it has never taken any commercial it has never been taken advertising, so it's been free of commercial pressures. And I would say there are some quite unique features. One is that every month, and there was an article written by one of the masters, that is Benjamin Creme's master, with whom he was in telepathic contact. His master wrote an article every month for the magazine. Now, Benjamin Creme died in 2016, but since then we have found that there are articles that are completely written as if they were written for today and for our times and our needs. So that's one thing. We also have more philosophical, esoteric articles which are based on, let's say, tenets of the Ageless Wisdom Teachings, but we also investigate absolutely new and sort of cutting edge, interesting ideas about perhaps new science, new technologies, certainly to do with, we highlight things to do with grassroots projects, community projects, and so on. And if people want to see how the masters work, I highly recommend reading letters sent in by readers to the magazine. Now, these letters have been received over decades, and we're still publishing them. We have a large archive of them still, and we receive new ones. And these letters describe extraordinary events in the life of an individual when they've perhaps had an experience, and this is always confirmed in the past. It was confirmed by Benjamin Creme's master. It was often the Master Jesus, who is one of the masters who works closely with Maitreya, or it was Maitreya appearing to someone to give advice, guidance, help, support, comfort. Sometimes people have been rescued from terrible possible potential accidents. People have been given healing and so on. And in all of these experiences, people have a sense that this was somehow an extraordinary person who has come at just the right time and told them something that they needed to hear or were helped in some way. And so I recommend highly reading Share International magazine. And just to quote Benjamin Creme, he said, make it the last thing you do, even if you're on your last legs and you're just about to leave this life, make sure that you take out a subscription on Share International. Make it the last thing you do. So that it comes very highly recommended. And it is very broad and inspiring. And I believe it is a source of great hope and inspiration to many people. So that's what I wanted to say about the magazine.
I do want to say that it's one of probably the only thing you can take with you to the afterlife.
Very good.
We have time for probably a couple more questions, Haley.
Sure. There's some great comments mentioning a lot of social movements in the questions. And one of the questions was, in your opinion, are movements like Black Lives Matter, someone mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, and the fact that we just passed the relief bill in the US, and the gender equality movement, things like that, signs that forces for change are gathering momentum.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask Shereen about this. Is there any relationship? What's the relationship between these sorts of movements and expanded consciousness about these issues. What's the relationship between that? And is there one between Maitreya, the world teacher, and the masters being in the world?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think there is one. I think these movements are, they show that we're not just thinking about ourselves, that we're part of a whole, that we're not individuals, we're not separate. I mean, a movement like Black Lives Matter is not, there's people of all colors that are advocating for Black Lives Matter. You either have a direct experience of racism, or you don't, and you want to be an ally for somebody that does. So I think certainly there is definitely a relationship between how our consciousness is expanding and how we're understanding that what affects our neighbor affects us. We could see something on TV that, is deeply moving to us, and just something small can just propel us into action and see what kind of movement can I join? What can I do about this? So yeah, I do think those movements are very positive, and they do show, the power of what a group of people can do. So you can not maybe, be in agreement, or maybe think that your government or politicians are moving too slow on a certain aspect, but as people gather together, it puts pressure on the government to make these changes. I mean, who would have thought, even 2 years ago, that there would be a $27 million settlement because, somebody killed George Floyd. I mean, that, who would have thought 2 years ago that was possible? But it was because of that movement, and because people are saying we're not going to accept that. And they're not looking out for just themselves and their children, they're looking out for their neighbor. So I think I think it's absolutely positive, and it does absolutely show that there is a growth in consciousness, in the States, but in lots of countries.
Okay.
Add to that indeed the group power is very important, because from an esoteric point of view, we are entering the age of Aquarius, and so our planet receives energy from the constellation of Aquarius, and that energy can be grasped in group formation. That is, that it is not as during the last period of the Pisces, where individuals were very important. Now the groups are more important, and the groups can express the energies, those spiritual energies coming from Aquarius. So that's why we also see these groups of civil society becoming so powerful, and what Shereen has said is really fantastic, isn't it?
That ties back into what you were saying earlier about people that want to make a difference in the world, finding people of like mind to work as a group together. Yeah, very much. Haley?
I guess this might have already kind of been covered, but this question is, why are Maitreya and the Masters emerging now? Is it in response to humanity's distress, or are there other reasons?
Who would like to? Luke, would you like to start? Well, I would say yes, they are coming now because we are ready. Because it would be too long to talk about the history of hierarchy and the history of humanity, which goes back to ages that are far beyond what the historians believe today. But let's say that the hierarchy is coming back to the everyday world because we are ready for it, because we have grown in consciousness to an extent that we're capable of accepting the reality of beings more evolved than we are, and being more self-realized than we are. Of course, we are not self-realized. And also, I think they are coming now because it's time. Otherwise, it would be too late. If we destroy ourselves, it would be too late. And so the prophecies of doom, I don't believe in them. But the reality still is that we have something like 2,000 nuclear bombs which can be thrown within 24 or 48 hours very quickly. So we are still at risk of destroying the world, not only through pollution, not only through climate change, not only through biological weapons, but also through nuclear weapons. So we are at a very dangerous stage where our minds, our science has evolved, but our love has not evolved, is not big enough but we are ready in consciousness to welcome the reality of masters. And at the same time, if we don't do the right things, we might destroy the planet.
Yes, and of course our planet, as we know, doesn't have many more years to go before we reach a point where we have done irreparable harm to so much of the natural world. So, Benjamin Creme's master warned about that some years ago. And we know because we're losing species, hundreds of species, thousands of species per year. And biodiversity is being seriously undermined. So for that reason too, the masters are here now, as Luke said, before we really make too wanton a destruction of the natural world, and also, as you said, possibility of destroying ourselves is real. But you know, 2020, 2021, this has been the great reality check, hasn't it? It is like, really, this is the time we have to get real, and this is the moment, and we have to make use of every single opportunity now, and we have to keep the pressure on to governments, to local governments, to regional, national governments, and demand also that across the board there are international cooperative efforts to solve the problems. It cannot just be one country on its own. All countries have to come together and work for the good of humanity. And that really is important. And we have to put the pressure on. But they're here now because, as Luke said, yes, we're ready for them, but there are serious dangers if we don't make changes. But there's all the hope.
Tomorrow, there's a very important meeting starting at the United Nations, which is the General Assembly of the Economic and Social Council of the UN. And they're going to discuss kind of a coordinated and multilateral plan of action, in particular for funding the conditions for a sustainable recovery after the pandemic. And they will talk about mobilizing financial resources. They will talk about debt relief or debt moratorium, women empowerment, and many other instruments that could be set up by the nations together in order to go to that cooperation for sustainable recovery. And so that's a hope.
That's a hope, so long as they don't go back to normal.
Well, I have one final question, if I may. The social movements, the state of the environment, these sorts of meetings that are going on at the UN, are these any indication, do you think, of when we may see the world teacher on the world stage?
Can I just say that I have the impression, many people I know in this group and people who have heard this message, I have the impression that people seem to think that we're waiting for Maitreya. And to my mind, this is exactly the opposite way around. It's the wrong way around. He is waiting for us. The masters are waiting for us. It is in our hands. I can't emphasize this enough. I believe that we have to take the steps required to make the conditions in order for them to be able to come forward. If Maitreya has to come forward, and he has said in the past, if there's a situation and he's perhaps forced by circumstance, perhaps we get ourselves into too much danger, it becomes too perilous in the world, well then they might step forward. Otherwise, it is really up to us to make the changes. After all, they have said that there are certain conditions that ought to be in place and should receive enough attention from us so that they may come forward. That's my opinion. Perhaps my fellow panelists have different opinions, but personally, I think we should get rid of this idea of everything's okay because they're here and at some point they will come forward and we just have to wait. It really is in our hands.
I absolutely agree. I can't say it better than Felicity said it. So.
Yeah, I do agree as well. I would say that we now, because of this crisis, which is a major crisis for humanity, we just have a couple of years to prove that we are able to move forward in the right direction. And if we do, Maitreya will step forward, inevitably. If we don't, well, I would not contemplate that.
Yeah.
I think Benjamin Creme used to say years ago that once Maitreya is out in front of the world, the real work begins, but it actually has already begun, in line with what Felicity says, and we have to keep that up.
Yes. You know, one thing, fortunately, on a number of levels, fortunately, thank goodness, the vaccine has been found and is doing its job, because it's given us a little more breathing space. Imagine if we'd been up against it all the time and didn't know how to deal with it. That would have been terrible. But it has lengthened the breathing space and the thinking time that we have. And that is the gift of 2020 and 21 so far. And we have to use that thinking time, the pondering, the finding out who we are, finding out what our priorities are, what has value to us, and putting that, implementing it so that it becomes part of everyday life. And so that the love that we've spoken about is love in action, is love implemented. There's no point in us saying we need to help those people and give them some aid. We're not talking about aid. This has to be love in action, and it has to be concrete, it has to be implemented, and we have to do it as soon as possible, in concert, collectively, because it is the time of the collective, the time of us all. It is our time. It's happened on our watch, and we have to fix it. This is the big reality check and the big think. We have to do it.
Well, that seems like a good note to end our program on, and we are out of time. And I want to thank our panelists, Felicity, Eliot, Shereen, Tayles, and Luke Guillory.
Good, very good.
And I'll keep practicing. And then Haley Moore, back up with the questions and such. And our technical team, thank you all for participating today. And I'd like to thank our viewers from around the world for being here today and joining us. We really appreciate you being with us and sharing this space. And I'd like to leave you with a couple of final ideas. Those of us who are involved in this work don't consider the information about the World Teacher and the Masters a mystical vision. They are real individuals, physically present in the world. And we, humanity, are on the threshold of a brilliant new civilization, based on a growing sense of ourselves as one interconnected whole. And if that is true, and we think it is, then it follows that our systems, our political, our economic, and our social systems need to reflect our interdependence and our spiritual nature. Whether or not we choose to fix our problems is up to us. No solutions will be imposed on us. But with the help of the World Teacher and the Masters, we can indeed create a world that works for everybody. So that's it for today. Take care of yourselves and be safe. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.